Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us here tonight. Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales, and it is great to have your company tonight for part of our Your Library at Home series. And this evening we have episode 2 of a special 6-episode series, A Foreign Country Travels Through the Past. This new fortnightly series has been curated and is being hosted by Will Christie. Will is a graduate of the Universities of Sydney and Oxford. He's a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and an Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University. He is, of course, very well known to many of us here this evening for his great corpus of work in Romantic Studies. He'll be hosting Anna Johnston this evening, and he's going to introduce Anna in just a moment. Please remember, if you have any questions for either Will or Anna this evening from tonight's talk, just use the chat feature in Zoom and we'll be getting to those questions after Anna's presentation. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, and welcome everybody to the second of our series of 6 lectures entitled A Foreign Country Travels Through the Past. In these lectures, 6 scholars from different universities representing a number of different humanities disciplines share their knowledge and some reflections on an aspect of cultural history that can tell us something about ourselves and about the choices we can and should be making. Tonight, we're going to hear from Anna Johnston, an associate professor in literature at the University of Queensland. Anna was an ARC, Queen Elizabeth II Research Fellow and Director of the Centre of Colonialism and its Aftermath at the University of Tasmania until 2016, before being awarded an Australian Research Council Future Fellowship on the topic of knowledge formation and the Australian settler colonies 1788 to 1900. Which she took up at the University of Queensland, where she became Deputy Director of the University of Queensland's Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. From 2016 to 2020, Anna was also a member of a multi-institutional ARC grant led by the University of Newcastle on intimacy and violence in Anglo-Pacific Rim settler colonial societies, 1830 to 1930, in which he focused on evangelical missionaries and colonial settlers who studied Indigenous languages in Australia and the Pacific. Anna's many books include Missionary Writing and Empire, 1800 to 1860, that's Cambridge University Press, 2003, The Paper War, Morality, Print, Culture and Power in Colonial New South Wales, University of Western Australia Press, 2011, and most recently, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, Writing from the Colonial Frontier. That's University of Sydney Press, 2021, co-authored with Elizabeth Webby. With her extensive interest in Australian literature and cultural history, from poetry and fiction to cookbooks and travel writing, Anna is regularly involved in the building and sharing of knowledge between universities and the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums that make up the GLAM sector. And she is especially well known and well loved here at the State Library of New South Wales. Tonight, the topic of Anna's talk is the Platypus Journal and the Felon Press, Science and Print Culture in Colonial Tasmania. Please, everybody, in the silence of your homes, welcome Anna Johnston.
Thank you very much, Will, for a lovely introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you all tonight and to be talking about some of my current research that I'm writing at the moment. So I really welcome the opportunity to speak and to discuss these matters with you at the conclusion of my paper. I'm speaking to you today from Meanjin, Brisbane, near the lovely Maiwar River. And I want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and particularly audience members who might be joining us tonight. I pay my respects to Indigenous knowledge holders in particular and ongoing knowledge traditions, because considering the interwoven nature of Indigenous and settler colonial science in colonial print culture is something that's core to my presentation tonight. And I begin not in the past, but the present. In the past 18 months, we have all become epidemiologists. Around our dinner tables, coffee catch-ups and social media posts, we parse and analyse the latest information about the COVID-19 epidemic. In 2020, when my colleagues at the University of Queensland and the CSL were working around the clock in a valiant attempt to produce an Australian vaccine solution, the UQ campus hummed with a kind of collective energy and competitiveness that we normally hear down the road at Suncorp Stadium during State of Origin matches. Our amateur scientific discussions, the ones I've been involved in, have been passionate and sometimes divisive. They are also deeply engaged in the major technical and social challenges of our era. Those with advanced knowledge and leisure time, perhaps enforced leisure time, might read the scientific literature directly, following these emerging fields of knowledge from the pandemic as they move from theorising to experimental sites to publication. Most people instead scan the media for digestible accounts of technical information. We test what we read and hear, matching its fit against our close circles and communities. While we might decry some of the reductive or mischievous interpretations of the science, the best public conversations show an energetic engagement with knowledge by amateurs and the critical role of expertise in informing the public sphere. At their best, these embody important social values, democratic, participatory processes that show citizens engage with scientific information, with social policy, and show their involvement in the major cultural and social and moral questions of our time. Now, these debates about scientific knowledge in the public sphere might feel unprecedented, but of course they have a history. As historians of science have reminded us, other pandemics have challenged human century since time began, and the rich print and visual culture of the history of science recorded these experiences in forms that we can still learn much from. Anti-vaccination debates about smallpox plagued the advancement of health initiatives that are explicitly designed to save lives, leaving a rich textual and visual archive with a deeply colonial history. Deciding where expertise lay, how to communicate it, and who might be the most persuasive spokespeople to translate research for the public are challenges with a fascinating history that humanities scholars are well placed to explain and share. In tonight's talk, I want to shift our attention now from the present to the past, think about the history of the scientific journals that publish and authorise knowledge. Although this was a global enterprise, I want to bring these questions about knowledge, expertise and authority in scientific publishing closer to home by paying particular attention to Australia's first scientific journal, the Tasmanian Journal of Natural Science, published in the 1840s. The journal was published in Tasmania, a colony well known at the time for its rich flora and fauna, its convict population, and for its notorious experiment with removing First Nations people from their traditional lands to enable settler expansion. Both the production of the Tasmanian Journal and its circulation across the Australian colonies and the imperial metropolitan centres reveal the complex conditions of knowledge production in colonial cultures. I suggest the Tasmanian Journal is a rich source through which we can examine past moral and social challenges alongside scientific innovation. We need new archives of the new readings of the colonial archives that fill the shelves of the State Library of New South Wales and many other amazing repositories that can pay attention to the coexistence of Indigenous knowledge alongside the emergence of settler science, in my example. And I believe we need this so that the history of science and of print culture can build better understandings of our past towards more informed and insightful discussions about science, culture, and expertise in the present and the future. Right, so the modern scientific journal, as we know it, only emerged in the mid to late 19th century. And it did so in the context of a vast expansion of publishing across a plethora of fields, from poetry to botany. Influential scientific associations increasingly used popular means of communication to inform a broader public about advances in science that had until then been dominated by elite gentlemen and their social and intellectual circles. 18th and 19th century intellectuals in Europe saw the sciences and the humanities as part of a spectrum of expertise. The kinds of publishing innovations that fueled popular literary magazines, evangelical missionary societies, and the burgeoning newspaper media were seized by entrepreneurs who imagined new readers and new markets for scientific knowledge. The Royal Society of London's Philosophical Transactions is the longest continually published scientific journal. But it was only in the 1830s that the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, William Whewell, persuaded the Royal Society to follow French innovations in publishing, which were creating accessible summaries of the long, erudite, wordy memoirs of science that dominated the traditional scientific academies. The Proceedings of the Royal Society was a cheaper monthly publication that would include abstracts of papers presented in person at the Society's meetings in London. It had pages to fill, and it created a space for reports of the knowledge that was flooding in from around the British Empire. In doing so, these new kinds of scientific publications invented the process of peer review and validation of research that are now critical to scientific publication and its credibility. Journals not only passed on scientific news, but also served as archives of new knowledge. As a result, it became increasingly common across the 19th century to conceive of science as a series of discrete events localized in time and connected with an individual author, rather than collective knowledge. Alex Cesar's 2018 study of the history of scientific journals in Western Europe asks, how did so much intellectual authority come to be loaded into this one format as opposed to others? And secondly, how did the public legitimacy of the scientific enterprise become so closely associated with the scientific literature? The modern scientific journal was an important innovation that connected knowledge communities dispersed across the British nation and across Europe, across a variety of fields and around the globe. In its wake, certain kinds of scientific knowledge became credible, while others languished. Alex Cesar focuses on authorship and the politics of knowledge and warns against an unproblematic celebration of the heroic invention of the scientific journal. He insists that we need to pay attention to how diverse conceptions of the public informed the history of science. He also notes that it was often those on the margins of scientific authority who brought new genres, formats, and values of science into changing practices of validation. The point is not simply then about the availability of knowledge, but about tracing the shifting structures of power that governed the scientific enterprise. So let's move our consideration from gentlemen writers of science in the metropolitan centres to one of Britain's distinctive southern colonial possessions to consider what alternative publics and publishing traditions we might find there. I need you to imagine yourselves into Old Government House in Hobart. Old Government House on the left. On the right-hand side is the drawing room in New Government House in Hobart, but I think we can imagine a similar space there. And if we had our mind's own view, we might peer in at a large dinner party held at Old Government House in August 1841, when Sir John Franklin's private secretary, Francis Henslow, artfully arranged the Government House dinner table with the first issue of the Tasmanian Journal of Science. Jane Franklin approvingly noted that copies were perused by the ladies as well as the gentlemen with much curiosity and interest. Sir John Franklin fondly called the journal the Platypus Journal. Like the famed Ornithorhynchus, rumours of the journal were at first considered a hoax by skeptics who doubted that scientific publication could take place in a far southern colony. Now, the platypus, of course, was a visual symbol that graced the journal's title page with a Latin tag that's translated variously, but something like whichever way you look at it, this is baffling. Or as Captain Parker, one of the dinner party guests, quipped, all things are queer and opposite here. This characterization of Tasmanian science as counterfactual and intriguing was highly influential. A range of commentators encouraged the collection of material from the colony. Visiting Royal Fellow Captain Matthew Friend explained in 1830 that many European commentators considered the island still a land of mystery, supposed to abound with anomalies, which, if verified and ably described, would tend much to illustrate many of the most abstruse and important questions in the history of organic life. Friend assured the settlers he met with at a local pub that observations made upon the spot and by residents could not fail to be more valuable than the hurried and imperfect sketches of the passing traveller who has not the advantage of repeating his experiments or of patiently abiding their results. Friend pressed upon the settlers that they should see themselves as amateur field workers for a metropolitan scientific enterprise in the 1830s. The Tasmanian Journal was the official organ of the Philosophical Society of Tasmania, established in 1837 by John Franklin, who described it as a little private scientific society consisting of only half a dozen individuals, which meets every fortnight in my library to read papers and converse. Its members included a number of notable local settlers and those representing key official roles in the colonial government. The official membership lists belied the critical role played by Jane Franklin and other Franklin women, including John Franklin's daughter Eleanor from his first marriage and his niece Sophia Craycroft. Jane was disappointed that the society languished during her frequent travels, including to the mainland. And so she instigated monthly dinner meetings for the Philosophical Society from May 1839. She said, "I thought if the members met at dinner, they would feel the matter to be of more importance and would attend better." Now, a variety of fantastic Australian scholars, mostly women, have recently re-examined the role of Jane Franklin across a variety of fields. Penny Russell has shown how Jane Franklin's intellectual curiosity and determination underpinned her public role in the colonies. Alison Alexander has described how Jane Franklin's role in the journal was just one of a series of ambitious plans Jane Franklin had for reforming colonial society. And a recent excellent PhD by Annalise Jacobs has traced the critical role of Jane and other women in the Franklin family in maintaining John Franklin's career and reputation, particularly after his disappearance in the Arctic after their Tasmanian experience. In Hobart, Jane Franklin's dinner parties underpinned significant intellectual endeavours. At the first Philosophical Society of Tasmania meeting, Edmund Hobson brought the microscope he had imported from Paris. He put a drop of platypus blood under the microscope to just demonstrate that its platelets were mammalian and published a paper about it in the first issue. Hobson was a colonial-born medical doctor who had recently returned from study abroad. He had met Richard Owen, who became a highly influential naturalist and paleontologist in the late 19th century. So these colonial connections were critical both for Hobson and indeed for Owen's career. Hobson's platypus observations were used by Owen to write the inaugural monotremata entry for the Cyclopedia of Anatomy and Physiology. The Tasmanian Journal sustained this illustrious connection between colonial and imperial inquiry, publishing 6 articles by Hobson and 7 by Owen. Hobson's final posthumous paper was accompanied by an important illustration by his wife, Margaret, and this is it up in the Diprotodon illustration, the top left of my screen. Hobson's death meant that Margaret Hobson's illustration and her subsequent donation of a trilobite were directly acknowledged in the journal, in a rare departure from the usual male domination of the public record. Edmund and Margaret Hobson's colonial studies of the fossil remains of marsupial megafauna made the Tasmanian Journal a crucial node within the incipient marsupial fauna network, Peter Minard notes. They were part of a long-running commentary about the peculiarities of Australian fauna and flora, past and present, that linked colonial and imperial science and publications. Colonial cultures enabled the participation of women such as Margaret Hobson and Jane Franklin in scientific activities in ways that were relatively unusual for the time. Elite scientific sociability worked in Hobart as it did in London to knit together an intellectual community with shared interests. Jane Franklin's dinner table gave her exclusive access to the most interesting visitors to Tasmania. Her acute political sense turned this to the advantage of her husband's government and his reputation, whilst also pursuing her own interests. Visitors working on scientific accounts or exploration narratives left the dinner table promising Jane Franklin a manuscript to be published in the Tasmanian Journal, or perhaps a specimen for the museum that she would soon build at Ancanthe, just outside of Hobart. One surgeon, Andrew Sinclair, had collected botanical and zoological specimens across his Navy career in the Cape of Good Hope and the Mediterranean. He was already a leading collector with pieces in the British Museum and Kew Gardens. He joined the Franklin's scientific dinner table on the 1st of September 1841. John Franklin proposed him as a corresponding member, and Sinclair promised Jane Franklin a paper on the Portuguese man of war, which was promptly published in the journal. So the journal became a material record of the Franklins' joint efforts to use science and education to change colonial culture, alongside and in complement to their official roles. From the southern colony, new data and observations were accompanied by astute assessments of the global pursuit of scientific knowledge, transmitted through the pages of the journal via the Franklin's rich professional and personal networks. The first volume's introductory essay was authored by Reverend John Lilly. This was a shrewd choice to appeal to local readers because Lilly was an acclaimed orator whose annual lectures for the Tasmanian Mechanics Institute were widely admired. And thinking about Will's talk last week, we can see here how oral and print cultures were harnessed together to build a colonial readership. Lilly situated the journal as effectively the transactions of the infant Philosophical Society of Tasmania, but quickly described its members as sincere and passionate scientific amateurs in the most part, who felt themselves labouring at a disadvantage from the distance from the institutions and leaders of science in Europe. The journal's scope included zoology, botany, geology and meteorology, aiming across time to publish an account of all the plants and animals indigenous to Tasmania. The journal also welcomed information on scientific subjects from other colonies, which often arrived through correspondence, especially through Sir John Franklin, who regularly read letters he had received at the Society's meetings and which were later edited for the journal. Colonial readers were distinctly addressed, with interesting extracts from recent European journals and scientific books drawn to their attention. Here again, Sir John Franklin's contacts were invaluable, for his mail often contained new publications. The journal heeded Matthew Friend's admonition about colonial speculations on dubious and undetermined questions of theory. Instead, it aimed to be a trustworthy repository of well-ascertained facts. Its desire for utility meant that the knowledge it produced was promoted as directly applicable in exploiting natural resources in settler agriculture, geology, and botany. The first issue was parcelled up and sent by the Franklins to their regular correspondents and allies in the Australian colonies and beyond. Strategically, copies were sent to London, to the Colonial Office, present and former Secretaries of State for the colonies, and the Home Secretary. Into Franklin's official dispatch bag, because the mail was free that way, went copies for the Royal Society of London and the other key scientific bodies, the Geological, Geographical, Statistical, Astronomical, and Linnean societies. Jane Franklin, too, sent copies back to England to family and friends. The Franklins also sent copies to their Australian counterparts who shared their passion for science, other governors, judges in Sydney, and the Archbishop. Alexander and William Macleay were sent copies which likely ended up in the Elizabeth House and Australian Museum libraries. One copy was sent to the poet and language collector Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, whose poetry, as Will mentioned, I have recently explored through the State Library of Archives. Dunlop's advocacy for Aboriginal interests in settler society sharply contrasted with Jane Franklin's dismissive attitudes towards Indigenous culture, about which more I'll say soon. When we consider the mailing list for the first issue of the journal, we can see these early examples of Australian scientific publishing as deeply embedded in the social and power relations of their time. The travels of this artifact of colonial print culture also show the mobility of people, ideas, and texts across the settler colonial South, and the ways in which they built up regional and global networks of knowledge. Connecting the process of ordering scientific knowledge within questions of politics and power is not unusual in the history of science. Many scholars have revealed how science and collecting were commonly aligned with imperial ideas and racial science. Suman Seth argues that knowledge should be put in its place. The idea, he says, that science and technology were among the gifts that Western imperial powers brought to their colonies was an integral part of the discourse of the civilizing mission, one vaunted by both proponents and critics of the methods of colonialism. By adding questions about the history of scientific publication, we can build a better understanding of how knowledge was produced and valued and circulated, what was considered important, and who could provide authoritative knowledge. Now, in this period, the conventional boundaries separating scientific expertise from general knowledge were gradually negotiated from the Enlightenment onwards in Europe. And the 1830s and 40s were a critical period in the European professionalisation of science. These innovations were mirrored in the Australian colonies, but here settler science and publications developed alongside new social institutions, such as the law courts, a free press, museums, and educational institutions. Questions of science were inseparable from the major social and cultural challenges of the time, including the place of ex-convicts and the role of Indigenous people. Scientific knowledge proved a rich ground for settler authority, though it often depended upon intimate and interpersonal, if unequal, engagements with Indigenous knowledge holders, guides, and go-betweens. Settler science could experiment with the innovative forms of scientific publication emerging in the Northern Hemisphere. It thrived on the improvisational frontiers of knowledge. But like many facets of colonial culture, it involved complex negotiations between knowledge and morality, and these are impressed throughout the pages of the Tasmanian Journal. The Franklins used the Tasmanian Journal as an intellectual visiting card, both locally and globally. When John Franklin had arrived in Hobart in 1837, the colonial press welcomed him as a highly decorated man of science and Arctic exploration. The arrival of this new and learned and urbane governor promised a change from the austere and autocratic penal regime that Governor George Arthur had maintained during the 1820s and 30s. Intellectual, artistic, and scientific pursuits were key markers of this new tone the Franklins sought to bring to colonial society. And Franklin's scientific connections were invaluable in connecting new directions in British science to Tasmania. In the 1830s, the magnetic crusade led by Edward Sabine and others sought to establish a global network of geomagnetic observatories. Its science won the support of the Royal Society because the massive data collection involved promised to lead to principles that might join laws of terrestrial magnetism to cosmical theories of the Earth's field. It also had the Admiralty's support because it promised safer navigation at sea through better understandings of magnetic north. Captain James Clark Ross led the Erebus and Terror expedition to establish the Southern Arctic geomagnetic field and spent 3 months in Hobart over winter 1840. The Franklins proved great patrons. Sir John ordered convicts to build an observatory. Jane Franklin named it Rossbank after Captain Ross and commissioned a portrait of it by the convict artist Thomas Bock. The personal connections established during that visit underpinned years of later correspondence, much of which ended up in the Tasmanian Journal. When the Franklins faced political problems in Tasmania, they used their scientific networks and the Tasmanian Journal to defend their reputation and their vision for a British colony governed by knowledge and an educated society. So how did others in the Australian colonies respond to the Tasmanian Journal? The Sydney Herald's glowing notice of the first volume emphasised the colonial contribution to British ambitions to take over French supremacy in the geomagnetic field. So much so good, a good old European national rivalry. Remote colonies such as Tasmania, the Sydney Herald was delighted to report, had a significant role to play in establishing British leadership in these observational sciences, joining up political and economic objectives with intellectual prestige. But intercolonial rivalries were also ignited. The Sydney Herald compared the Tasmanian Journal to a good publication from an English provincial town. But emanating as it does, they said, from the press of Van Diemen's Land and from a scientific society there, it is still more wonderful. But the paper uncomfortably noted that it might have been reasonable to expect that Sydney, as the southern metropolis, should have had the first society and journal of record. The Port Phillip Gazette across Bass Strait declared the Tasmanian Journal to be a very creditable publication from a flourishing vineyard of literature. But it also used the opportunity to spruik an intended publication, the Melbourne magazine, spurring its colonists to produce a rival in emulation for the literary fame of Australia, Felix. The Tasmanian Journal was distinctly formed amidst a robust colonial culture of writing and publication. That world could be almost as idiosyncratic as its scientific specimens. And John and Jane Franklin frequently complained about what they termed the Felon press. During the 1820s and 30s, a free press had emerged in New South Wales and Tasmania after the early government control of official gazettes. Debates about newspapers played out the deep divisions between free settlers and ex-convicts, because early newspaper editors tended to be either religious clergy or convict emancipists. The latter were controversial because elite colonists believed the press was a site for establishing public discourse and morality. Some ambitious editors used their papers to create new public conversations, questioning the old penal system, advocating for the end of transportation, and encouraging new kinds of colonial society. In Tasmania, Andrew Bent established the Colonial Times in 1825. Ambitious or troublesome local colonists, such as the Cambridge-educated ex-convict Robert Lathrop Murray, contributed to the Colonial Times and established energetic, if short-lived, papers that thrived on small-town gossip and volatile politics. A succession of colonial governors experienced regular, interested opinion in their activities, merits, and policies in a noisy and ever-changing press market. A free press also provided a robust sphere of public opinion through which reputations were made and destroyed, and key elements of liberal society were debated. The press was a key mechanism for both circulating and managing the scandals that dogged colonial societies and followed empire's mobile subjects despite their wishes. While on the one hand this was mere gossip, scandal was also a way of debating morality. In colonial society, the distance from Europe meant that core principles of civil society were open to challenge and reshaping in distinctly modern and southern ways. By the time the first issue of the Tasmanian Journal was ready for publication in 1841, each of the elite colonial members of the Tasmanian Philosophical Society had such objections to the various newspapers or their proprietors in Tasmania that they did not want to give them the printing business. John Franklin was approached to see if the government press and its type could be used. This was technically a use of government resources for a private purpose, but Franklin was prepared to ride out any criticism, in part because of his genuine belief in the role of science and philosophical exchange in improving colonial society. Jane Franklin was also experiencing unpleasant personal attacks in the press. The Tasmanian Journal chose to keep its intellectual business away from their colonial critics. Even the choice of printing press then made the Tasmanian Journal politically contested. One newspaper proprietor complained directly to the Colonial Secretary's office about the use of the government printing press. The Port Phillip Gazette admired the Tasmanian Journal, but noted that accusations of improper government influence had been exerted in its production. Importantly, though, the governor's patronage of the material production of the journal ensured that this scientific publication was well positioned to withstand financial pressures that sank similar initiatives in Britain as well as in the colonies. If the Tasmanian Journal was flanked on the one side by the emergence of the free colonial press, on another side, Indigenous voices were joining the public sphere. First Nations people began adapting colonial print cultures introduced through missions. By the late 1830s, young Indigenous leaders such as Walter George Arthur and Thomas Bruni, who had been educated at the orphan school in Hobart, began to use letter writing and petitions to protest the conditions of their confinement at the Waibalina Aboriginal establishment on Flinders Island. In 1836, Bruni and Arthur co-signed a prospectus and the handwritten first edition of the Flinders Island Chronicle, a proposed weekly journal motivated by George Augustus Robinson's intention to, he said, induce emulation in writing, excite a desire for useful knowledge, and promote learning generally. The Flinders Island Chronicle was ambitiously promoted as a weekly newspaper to be entirely written by Aboriginal authors, with the profit to be redistributed within the community. Although only one edition was produced, the experience proved valuable to the community. Exposure to humanitarian print culture produced Indigenous readers as well as writers and empowered them to form new imagined communities. The catechist Robert Clark described how several of the people he knew on Flinders Island are able to read the newspapers, and Walter Arthur has read to them some of the Aboriginal periodicals, humanitarian magazines specifically about Indigenous issues. He said, "The Aborigines are quite alive to the warfare going on in New Zealand and anxious to hear about their sable compatriots whenever I get a paper. Indigenous Tasmanian awareness of the Maori Wars explicitly connects the kinds of accommodations they had made in the colony with Governor Arthur to Indigenous struggles over land and sovereignty in other settler colonies." In 1843, Walter Arthur wrote a series of letters about Waibalina Commandant Dr. Henry Jenneray's inadequate medical care, using his connections with former chaplains to make official complaints about the rising death rate among his community. By November, Jenneray was stood down as superintendent because of the death of a soldier. When in 1846, Jenneray was reinstated at Waibalina, Walter Arthur and other Indigenous leaders directly petitioned Queen Victoria. Arthur and other leading men used print culture and local humanitarian sympathisers to present Indigenous concerns to the heart of empire. This has been claimed as one of the first significant acts of First Nations political activism in Australian history. Their petition recognised prior agreements made with Governor Arthur to cede their territory, cease hostilities, and relocate to Flinders Island. But the petition to Queen Victoria was a formal textual intervention that sought to emphasise correct relations between a free sovereign people and the imperial queen, and to ask for her intercession to remove a troublesome colonial official. Tracy Banavanua-Mar argues that these protests exemplify a new imperial literacy. It was a literacy that went beyond letters and numbers to a proficiency with concepts, which in turn emerged from deeper counter-imperial processes. Indigenous proficiency with natural history was among those new literacies, although the pages of the Tasmanian Journal only occasionally reflect this. Penny Olson and Lynette Russell note that the ornithologist John Gould often travelled with Indigenous guides in southeastern Australia. In Hobart, Gould and his illustrator wife Elizabeth were warmly welcomed by the Franklins, and John Gould went to Flinders to collect specimens. There he learnt about mutton birds during his travels with about a dozen Indigenous men. The young boy Timon Menidic, or Timmy, accompanied Gould back to Hobart as part of Jane Franklin's sporadic and mostly destructive engagements with Indigenous children. Gould described the 9-year-old as a most interesting little fellow, throws the spear waddy with utmost dexterity and extremely useful to me in the bush, and I, like a hawk, discovers birds' nests and eggs in a most astonishing manner. Gay Sculthorpe has suggested that the collaboration between the two was influential to Gould's ongoing researches that underpin the definitive study Birds of Australia, also that the time away from the Wyberlina settlement would have been important for Timmy to continue customary practices, even during the community's forced exile. Jane Franklin would have dismissed Gould's appreciation of Timmy's skills, for she considered the boy lazy and unteachable and tried to return him first to the orphan school and then to Flinders Island. Eleanor Franklin, however, noted that the child was anxious to be able to read and to write well. Gould's sole publication for the Tasmanian Journal featured not the mutton bird, but the bush turkey. His article made clear his experiences with Indigenous guides in New South Wales, who taught him about the bird's peculiar nest and egg making practices. When we know how to look for it, we find that Indigenous knowledge informed settler colonial science throughout this formative period. Local Tasmanian residents, such as Ronald Gunn, were dissatisfied with the cursory assumptions made about the local environment. In a substantive 1845 article, Gunn carefully described the shell middens that had shaped the shores of Tasmanian coasts as evidence of the deep history of Indigenous habitation and use of natural resources. But of course, Gunn had to make some assumptions about this information, given that Indigenous Tasmanians were no longer using these places, having been usurped by colonisation and removed from country. The notorious Tasmanian experiment with First Nations peoples in many ways mitigated against a fluid scientific exchange located in place. Jane Franklin's frankly unsympathetic view of Indigenous people and their culture also curtailed the presence of Palawa culture in the journal beyond intermittent ethnographic reports by individual colonists. Only 3 articles on Tasmanian language and culture were published during the life of the journal, and they provided much more insight about colonial collectors than Indigenous users of language. Writers in the Tasmanian Journal from other colonies showed what greater insights were possible when cross-cultural knowledge exchange was based around multiple actors with sufficient agency to negotiate the terms of their engagement in scientific activities. And there's a long narrative of William Colenso's travels in the North Island of New Zealand, which ends up being published in the Tasmanian Journal, as well as the London Journal of Botany, which shows much more fluid and interactive knowledge exchange between Colenso and the named Maori individuals with whom he learnt. Indigenous knowledge travelled these same circuits as settler science, from local lived knowledge of place, through interpersonal transmission, through colonial print, to imperial science and literature, although few non-Indigenous commentators were as prepared as Colenso to recognise their dependence on Indigenous informants and collaborators. In a recent study of Indigenous textual cultures in the age of global empire, Tony Ballantyne and Lockie Patterson focused on the Indigenous authored texts which delivered literacy and print beyond missionary or colonial control, such as the Wyberlina Petition. They argue that texts were powerful engines that created connections and entanglements of various kinds. The foundational texts of Australian science published in the Tasmanian Journal are not Indigenous authored per se, but they bear the traces of Indigenous and settler co-production and the mutual dependencies of the colonial frontier. Bringing together the history of colonial science and the history of colonial print culture, as I have done in this paper, similarly seeks to understand the Tasmanian Journal as a text with a particular kind of energy and circulation that was deeply colonial and invested in imperial circuits. When we begin to pick at the glue that bound the Tasmanian Journal, we certainly find that its pages were shot through with colonial power and privilege, as embodied by that dinner table at Government House in Hobart. But we also find rich evidence of competing agendas inflected by gender and race, of aspirant settler societies using publication to become colonial, and Indigenous peoples using science to negotiate their own new imperial literacies and colonial modernities. The journal shows one part that Australia played in creating, circulating, and authorising knowledge. Given the colonial history of that time, both the emergence of what we might call settler science and the role of Indigenous peoples and knowledges needs to form part of that story. I suggest we learn how to reread these early examples of Australian science, both as deeply embedded in the social and power relations of their time and as resonant artefacts that are available for new readings by new communities. When we bring this history back to our present moment, we might hope to connect the public conversations about scientific and social challenges of the colonial period with our own. We have learned to look for scientific sources for expertise and guidance, and to help us make the vernacular interpretations that shape our everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was excellent. I've got a whole sort of list of questions, but I'm going to turn it over to the audience because I won't be selfish about this. Though I will, I think, before we start to get questions coming in, I might just sort of start with one of my own, if I may, just to at least to facilitate things. The establishment of scientific journals, as you say, in the 20s and 1820s and 1830s. Prior to that, of course, science was the province of the bigger generalist journals, in a way that usually had either named sections that or just integrated articles on scientific topics with articles on politics and travel and all the other things. I suppose I'm wondering what kind of audience the journal had. You talked about sort of the amateur scientists. I wonder if that was a word that they would have used of themselves at that stage, and whether it really would, any educated person would have seen themselves or thought of themselves as in some scientifically literate to some extent. And so it wasn't just a sort of an audience of scientists, so to speak, as we might find with a modern journal, but it would be most educated people would have had some pretension to scientific knowledge as it stood in 1841.
Yes, well, fantastic question. And I suppose what really interests me is that sometimes we assume that these questions were settled in Europe, you know, that all of these decisions about knowledge and authority and about publication, you know, had been sorted out there in Australia, you know, kind of followed its own way through those things. But of course, they were live debates in European circles at the same time. And I guess one of the things that always fascinates me is not that Australia and the other colonies do these things later than what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, but often they're trying the same, they're asking the same questions at the same time. So it's certainly the case that older forms of publication had, you know, mixed together science and literature, travel accounts, and that those journals had across, you know, the 18th, but particularly the 19th century, had developed really broad readerships. This is, of course, the time in Europe where literacy takes a sharp upturn. Yeah. So we have the combination of an uptake in literacy and an improvement in print technology, which means that it's possible for, you know, the tract societies, for example, to produce vast amounts of cheap religious literature which could be distributed. And so whilst this paper's really talked a lot about kind of elite science and about the kind of the gentleman science model, and that's an important tradition, both science and print are kind of modes of self-improvement which are highly prized and highly used, you know, throughout the 19th century to bring new communities into a kind of a knowledge economy. And I'm always very interested to see print as one crucial part of that, but to think about the different kinds of ways in which knowledge was made available, knowledge making was made available to an increasing variety of people. And that was happening in England and in Europe as it was happening in Australia.
Yeah, and thank you for your reference to public lectures as well, because that was obviously very important. The other thing that comes to mind is the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, which of course sets itself up early and as you say, exploits the new print technology after, you know, the steam press and all of that kind of thing. Now we have one question, Anna. One of our audience members has read that Jane Franklin was so scared of snakes that she tried to have all the snakes killed in Tasmania. Is that true?
I believe it to be true. Look, there are people who have written fantastic biographies of Jane Franklin, but it certainly is a comment about Jane Franklin. Jane Franklin was quite interesting. She was very intellectually curious. She was a good reader. She was a very interventionist editor for a number of the papers that she solicited for the Tasmanian Journal. There are some lovely anecdotes that you can pick up in when one reads her journals and diaries about the kind of the bruising experience of being edited by Jane Franklin. So she certainly used her own skills as an editor and enthusiastic consumer of scientific literature to shape the journal that she had the opportunity to engage with. There are articles about snakes in the Tasmanian journals, so she didn't exclude snakes, but she was a very interesting figure in the colonial landscape and has been subjected to, well, at the time and since, has been subjected to quite a lot of speculation. You know, she's a fascinating figure.
She is. Thank you. Now, we have another question. Someone is curious to know if you have any thoughts about the use of Latin, like the spectacular motto of the Platypus seal, as a marker of imperial and colonial knowledge. How much was Latin employed, as it was, of course, in a number of the sciences?
Yes, that's a great question. So I guess we see at the time, both in the colonies and in Europe, really major debates about what kind of knowledge mattered being played out. And so the traditions of Latin and Greek, a broad knowledge of the classics, was seen to be foundational to the kinds of education that were available to the elite parts of society. So William Werrell, for example, who I mentioned as one of the people who instigated the Royal Society's proceedings, I mean, he was highly influential in education debates. And at the time in the 1830s, there were many debates about the kind of the preservation of the importance of classical education versus these innovative kinds of knowledge that were flooding in. And people like Werrell were keenly engaged in both defending that tradition with its kind of elite assumptions, but also being interested and provoked by these new forms of scientific knowledge and education that came in. So I think absolutely that kind of knowledge of classical is critical to maintaining a community of educated people who shared a common vocabulary. But those kinds of modes of controlling knowledge were also under increasing pressure. And you can see even in Tasmania, you know, the Mechanics Institute is coexisting or preceded the Philosophical Society, and, you know, mechanical institutes like Societies for Diffusing Useful Knowledge were about diversifying the access to knowledge and use of knowledge, even though they were often run by kind of benevolent, you know, elite members of society. So these are the kinds of tensions, I guess, which we see across both particular disciplines and in that public debate about the role of education.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's perfect, a perfect answer, but perfectly timed as well, because we've reached exactly 6:30, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody here tonight when I say thank you so much for a really, really interesting, we've got so much to talk about, But we've run out of time. So on behalf of everybody, I'll say thank you. And good night to everybody else. Thank you for coming. And remember, in 2 weeks' time, we return and looking at the slave trade and at slavery in the 19th century globe. Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.